Welcome to Year 9 History. This is the video to support your guided reading on the introduction to the topics and learning that you will undertake this year. The format is one that you should be familiar with. The text runs through the middle of the pages that you're going to read. On the left-hand side in the column Available, you are going to create a title for each of the paragraphs that you're going to read. As you read your way through the text, you feel free to highlight the text if that's your preferred way of working, and make brief notes on the content of each paragraph on the right-hand side. That's the format I want you to use as you work through this document. Welcome to Year 9 History. Your great-great-great-grandparents, had they been born in 1900, would have lived through one roller coaster of a ride and have some stories to tell you. They are the ones in the family photograph albums in black and white. Those pictures that look familiar and yet somehow remote and disconnected to you today. Colorize those pictures or change old film footage from World War I using computers and your great-great-great-grandparents suddenly seem very, very real, almost knowable. Imagine the stories they could tell, the advice they could give, and the lessons you could learn. The 20th century started out with such optimism and ended 100 years later a far safer place than the time in between, which was, looking back, often dangerous, violent, at other times fun, and, like your life, no doubt, even boring and remarkably normal to those living through it. It may not be the century in which you were born, but it is probably the century your parents were born in. You will likely, if you have not done so already, claim your parents don't understand you and the world you live in. But have you ever thought about the world they came from? What was the history that shaped their lives? How did they cope with only 4 television channels? Having to walk to the television to change channel? Slow Wi-Fi? No Wi-Fi? Landline phones? Cars that regularly broke down? And, did I say, only 4 television channels? Following 99 years of peace in Europe, the wealth and power of the Industrial Revolution and the building of empires that took over 90% of the world meant that European countries, with Britain in the lead, were at the height of their power. Yet history is about constant change. Countries rise and countries fall. Countries innovate and countries stagnate. Europe was about to be challenged by the rise of outsiders, and its time at the top ended. The United States and the USSR in the first half of the century, joined by China towards the end of the century, would redraw the map of global power. Europe itself would descend first into the carnage of World War I, and then 21 years later, World War II. The words of Robert Leckie dramatically paint the picture at the end of World War I. At 11 o'clock in the morning of the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th year, 1918, the guns of the Great War fell silent. The little moon shone on those silent, dark heaps of rubble that were once towns and cities, making crooked silhouettes of broken church crosses and toppled Gothic towers. Darkness brought crowds of singing, shouting soldiers into no man's land, to caper among the cruel black lace of the barbed wire. They exchanged prisoners or swapped German meat for British cigarettes or French cognac. Bonfires were lighted. Rockets and flares, trailing their long red tails, were fired at the brightening wisp of a yellow dawn, shining palely on the obsidian seas, silently rolling over fleets of sunken ships and armies of drowned men and untold stores of treasure lost forever. Soon complete silence engulfed those gouged and gutted farmlands that had become battlefields, and the sickle moon, having reached the zenith, slowly began its descent, while beneath it the cataclysm that had convulsed the world came to a shuddering stop. But the consequences of World War I did not stop when the fighting did. Politically, great empires like Germany, Austria, and Russia were destroyed, and the map of the world, especially Europe, was redrawn. Socially, people questioned the actions of their governments in fighting such bloody wars. The responsibilities of governments to their people was redefined, and women in Britain successfully gained the vote, continuing the change in power and the way in which our country is governed. Economically, the wealth of the world moved westwards across the Atlantic to the United States, which was untouched, empowered, and made fabulously wealthy by the recent war. You will study how new wealth and power changed the United States for both good and bad, and you will compare its version of democracy to our own. The economic change left the world very unstable, as illustrated by the events of the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. The globalization of the world, brought about in large part by Britons over the previous centuries, meant that events in Wall Street in 1929 affected everyone in the world like falling dominoes. Unable to understand such events, the leaders of the world's most powerful countries were helpless to help the tens of millions of people made unemployed who were starving and increasingly angry at the failure of their democracy to solve their problems. Of course, the Great Depression also played into the hands of those people angry at the consequences of World War I. The losers, like Germany, with 3 million dead and the punishment of being blamed. Those who felt cheated at the outcomes of the war, despite being on the winning side, like Italy and Japan. And finally, the USSR, who chose an entirely new form of government after the Russian Revolution of 1917. These countries all moved away from democracy and turned to dictatorships to solve the problems that they felt democracy had failed to solve. Democracies and dictatorships struggled to live side by side, and this set the scene for the greatest war in history, World War II. The War of 1939 to 1945 killed, injured and maimed more people than all the previous wars in history combined, and the democracies united, known as the Allies, to defeat the dictatorships came very close to losing the war. There were no front lines in this war as everyone was a target. Armies fighting, naval clashes at sea, and cities bombed by planes and rockets. Plymouth was one of the most intensely bombed cities in the world. The British Army was driven back to the beaches of Dunkirk to be evacuated in 1940, whilst the Germans advanced deep into the USSR in 1942. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 and turned another European war into a global conflict. New and more powerful weapons were developed to gain an advantage, a process which ended by the development of the atomic bomb by the United States and the United Kingdom, being dropped on 2 Japanese cities. These were weapons of such power that humans could now potentially destroy all life on Earth. We had never had such power, and so far have avoided using them for anything other than threatening one another. We have a habit to think of history as unchanging, and the way we live our lives as normal. If you just take a moment to reflect on how much change has already happened in your lifetime, think about your first mobile phone, for example, or games console, you will see that change is constant. Now think about the changes your parents, grandparents and great-grandparents have lived through. No wonder they may occasionally want to rest. Study the past to understand the present. Brace yourself for the future.